Hey, everybody. Welcome. Happy Friday. Welcome to today's edition of Music Policy Forum Live, our weekly conversation program where we talk with stakeholders from across the music spectrum about how we can collectively work towards building stronger, more resilient, and more equitable music ecosystems. I'm Michael Bracy with Music Policy Forum. As always, incredibly humbled and appreciative that you're spending some of your Friday with us. For those of us in North America, this is a holiday weekend, so particularly appreciative of you spending some of your pre-holiday or actual holiday time today in the program. A lot to get to, and today's program is particularly meaningful for us. We have a couple of guests who really exemplify what we've attempted to do for this program over the last 14 months in terms of bringing in global perspectives and new thinking and different ideas. And I'm really excited, to get into the program in a few minutes. A couple pieces of housekeeping before we get into that. If you are so inclined, don't feel like you have to. If you're so inclined, put your name and where you're coming from in the chat. We love getting a sense of the global audience that we have and just the diversity of people who participate in this program. If you have questions throughout the show, feel free to use the Q&A window and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can. As always, the show is being recorded and will be part of our Music Policy Forum archive, along with, oh my God, I think we have 50 hours of programming right now on the website. Alex Dolvin, our producer, has done a fantastic job, not only helping run the live program, but keeping the archive up to date. We really encourage you, if you have downtime, taking a car ride or something, there's some real fun, interesting programs and past conversations. And in some ways, what we've been able to present is sort of a time capsule and it's sort of a real-time sense of how all of us have been dealing with the realities of the shutdown and the complexities of the last year. This is, I think I'm happy to say, the last edition of this program in its current format as a weekly program. Starting in June, we're going to go to a new programming format, which we're excited about, and we'll be sort of making some formal announcements next week. But this program is going to move to monthly, and we're going to be doing other programming on other Fridays that many of you may find interesting. Again, we'll be sending out some information about what our program models could look like going forward. So we're, again, particularly excited that you are with us, and it's so great to see so many familiar names in the audience. It's really been it's been a real honor, again, to do this on a weekly basis for the past year and a half. All right, enough of that. Couple of news updates before we get into the guests. We are hearing rumblings that the shuttered venue operator grant money, at least the process is moving slowly. Anecdotally, it feels like some people are getting grant notices or the next stage in the process to getting their funding released. We're obviously excited by that, and hopefully everyone's going to get that done in the next week or two. Washington, in the meantime, continues to muck along with a whole lot of stuff. The infrastructure legislation that we've talked about is very uncertain in terms of what that may look like. And just about 15 minutes ago, President Biden released his fiscal year 2022 budget proposal. And, because we are totally dorky and because I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C., I've got a little slide that Alex is going to put up here. And I'm just going to spend a second explaining how this process works in terms of federal spending, because for a lot of us, this may be old hat. For a lot of folks, this may be new and may not have been thinking a lot about the process by which the federal government spends money. And this is a little bit of a simplification of the process, but really what we traditionally have in Washington are two parallel processes. And the major process, again, is the annual appropriations, which is how Congress decides how much money is going to be allocated to each agency. And today's submission of the budget request is an important part of that process. The president makes recommendations for Congress. Those recommendations are never followed, but they really outline the administration's priorities, and it's basically a political document. It basically is kind of a wish list. Again, that document went out literally about 10 minutes ago, so I've not had a chance to go through it in any detail, but it'll be interesting to see where the administration comes down in terms of arts funding, education funding, Corporation for Public Broadcasting, some of the other priorities, and some of the federal spending that intersects with our with our priorities here in the States. Congress typically then will pass a budget resolution, which will basically be setting caps or goals for how much money should be spent in each of the 13 separate appropriations bills, which are grouped according to different agencies or are grouped into different bills. The House and Senate will run parallel processes in terms of where they want to spend their money and how much for each agency. Then they'll negotiate that. And then later in the year, right around, typically, the fiscal year ends on September 30. So typically this spills into October, November, sometimes December. They'll negotiate kind of an omnibus spending package, or they'll just kind of kick the can down the road and do a continuing resolution to funding things at current levels. Something that's really important for us, and again, we're all just trying to keep up, and there's just so much happening, but something that's very important for the music community moving forward is that this is the first year in, I think, 15 years that earmarks are coming back into annual appropriations process. And what that means is that members of Congress are able to basically specify that in a larger funding pie, they would like a specific amount of money to be dedicated towards a particular project or a particular organization, which would either be a public entity or a nonprofit. So for those of you that either work in music-facing nonprofits or work with city agencies that are looking for programming dollars, if you want to kind of have direct funding instead of having to go through a grant-making process at an agency, you can go to your congressional representatives and ask them to support, it's called directed spending. The colloquial term for it is an earmark. You can ask for that. And this year is going to be very challenging because we're late in the game. But as we move into future years, that's something to think about as you're dealing with your delegation. Do you have a specific ask for a couple $100,000 for a particular project that is worthy, that would be beneficial for your music community? So that's the appropriations process. The parallel process, again, is sometimes there's emergency or supplemental spending. That's what we've seen last year with the CARES Act and the American Recovery Act. That is what the infrastructure bill is that's being negotiated now. These are pieces of legislation that don't have to pass, and they can fall apart, and maybe they just don't happen. So sometimes they happen, sometimes there will be emergency bills, sometimes there won't be, but the annual appropriations process has to happen every year, and that's how the government is funded. So that's when you hear the news today about the president's budget, that's what that is. The president has kicked off that annual process through his budget request. Anyway, that's it for wonky stuff on that. Lots of other news that we're not going to go into right now. But I love to welcome in our first guest because we've got a lot to talk about with our folks. So Mark Davyd, Music Venue Trust, is very graciously joined us again. And first, Mark, how are you? Why don't we just start with that? How are you? How's Bev? How's Music Venue Trust? What's happening with reopening?
Yeah, we're pretty good. We're tired. I think everybody's tired. Situation in the UK at the moment is that we have the four nations of the UK. England is now open for socially distanced shows at 1 meter, so like three feet social distancing. Wales yesterday announced that they would be open with socially distanced shows that was 1.5 meter, which is more like 5 foot social distancing. Scotland still hasn't done that, and Northern Ireland has done nothing at all except ban live music. So it's kind of it's moving in the right direction. We've got some concerns about new variants of the virus, which I don't know. You'd have to tell me, Michael. I don't know whether that's a concern in the US yet, but certainly where we are, that's what the papers are buzz with. Generally speaking, all of the data is indicating that we're heading towards the full opening that's planned for the 21st of June. The concern is the variants. So, yeah, pretty good. We had, in the last 10 days, there have been just over 1,200 shows across our network. And the good news is that all of them were sold out. I mean, they're operating at about 24% capacity, but we're kind of taking joy where we can find it. That actually there's a massive appetite for live music out there. We've just done a very big survey. 28,000 people took part in a survey. And the enthusiasm for live music coming back was huge. 78% of people were willing to come back to live music pretty much right now. And the reluctance was around, interestingly for this conversation, the reluctance was not around COVID status certification or any of the kind of measures that we've heard a lot about people not liking. They were, this particular audience, live music audience, was more resistant to masks.
Yeah.
They didn't want to go to live gigs in masks. They didn't mind showing a certificate of whether they were vaccinated or had a test, less than they minded and objected to having to wear a mask. But so pretty good. I'd like a holiday.
Yeah, I bet. I bet you all have earned it. I mean, and clearly the states are in such a interesting and complicated situation. Again, everybody participating in this meeting, has probably been tracking what happened 2 weeks ago with the Centers for Disease Control, and in an effort to, really, we've sort of hit the side of the vaccine curve where it didn't become a supply issue, became a demand issue. And there's plenty of supply at this point, and now it's the process of how do we encourage the last 25, 30, 35% of folks to go ahead and get it done. And my assumption, I don't know this is just an assumption, I could be dead wrong, but part of a messaging effort there was to basically clarify, if you're vaccinated, you're good to go. And if you're not vaccinated, then you're going to have to make a whole lot of complicated life choices about where you mask up and who you can be around and who you can see. And the challenge, and we talked about this last week in the program, the challenge with this, of course, is that buried in the fine print of this announcement was that people still need to respect state, local, and, corporate, kind of protocols. And so venues, really could and should have the right to do what they feel is going to be appropriate to protect their clientele, their employees, their patrons, et cetera. But that really is bumping up against some public messaging, which is really going the other direction, which is that we're good to go. And we're certainly seeing, in the mass kind of attendance side, in terms of sports, you're seeing Madison Square Garden packed for basketball. You're seeing baseball stadiums packed. You're seeing a lot of both indoor and outdoor, events at large scale. And I think everybody, frankly, Memorial Day last year was when everything broke sideways in the United States. I mean, this was literally the time when we felt like things were tracking. We were going to be able to be outdoors. Everything was kind of under control. We'd done a good job, behaving ourselves in the spring, and then everything went haywire. And so I think everyone's keeping a close eye on the numbers to see where we are in a couple of weeks, and the variants are a concern, and the other issues are a concern. So it's, we're typically doing this American way, which is, confusing. So that's good.
Just to say that, Michael, honestly, it's not any better anywhere else in Europe, right, to be honest. Particularly, I would touch on one of the things I think we all need to think about during this crisis is that, for whatever reason, some justifiable science reasons at the beginning of this, some data and evidence driven reason, live music was identified as a particular risk. I think you've heard me say before, well, sometimes when I listen to scientists describing the risks that there are that you might contract the virus, that sounds like a description of a live music event.
Right.
Don't be too close. Don't be inside, inside. Don't be too active. Don't breathe in. I mean, these are all things that are fundamental to the live music experience. So it's been interesting that as the science has developed, and we've understood more about the transmission risks through droplets, through direct transmission, through contact, which is kind of starting to fall out of the magnified focus now. Actually, the press, the media, and in our case, a lot of local government is way behind where the science is. And we've seen that in the last 10 days. We have seen enforcement of conditions that no longer apply. Mm-hmm. And frankly, very, very fractious relationships between enforcement agencies, venues, customers as well. Our big thing at the moment is that the government in the UK has, frankly, they're so far behind the public, mm-hmm, that a lot of the advice and guidance they have for live music events doesn't make sense to the public anymore. At the moment, you can't host a choir, mm-hmm, for a choir practice. So choirs can't get together to rehearse. but 10,000 sports fans can gather together in a stadium and sing inappropriate songs about footballers.
Right.
So how does that work?
Right.
You know that. Yeah, and I've just seen Graham in the chat windows there seemed to indicate that musicians with a threat vector, not the audience. Well, yeah, we're having that one as well. We've had venues where an enforcement officer has come in with demanding that the singer should be 6 meters away from the audience, which is guidance from April last year that was widely criticized at the time and then disproved by the science.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of hangover. The reason I sort of wanted to mention it is because it's reputational.
Yep.
We have a reputational problem, and I think you and me discussed what we might talk about. This is going to hang over us for quite a few years.
Yeah.
There's been a big push on how risky this is, and that's going to be a problem.
One of the reasons we wanted to check back in with you, Mark, is and again, I mean, I think, in the States, we've had, the Music Policy Forum team has had the enormous privilege of, bouncing around these Rev cohort meetings for the last, 14 months and just taking the temperature in different communities and getting a sense of what people are talking about and what they're concerned about and what they're excited about and where there are opportunities. I think everybody does need a holiday. Everybody does need a break. We can't just careen into the next set of things we need to think about, but we also need to do that, right? We need to be able to, when the time is right, to be able to refocus and sort of re-energize. And one of the things I want to talk to you about today, again, and this is certainly true of Music Policy Forum, we didn't exist because of the crisis. Like, we've been doing this work for a long time. And at some point, we're going to be getting back to the broader vision of why our organizations exist and the work that we're trying to do. And we're going to be doing that informed by this experience of the last year and a half. And certainly you can't ignore that. But I know you guys are starting to kind of look over the horizon a little bit and think about, okay, where are we going next in terms of picking up things that we had to postpone or kind of put off, or things that are even more relevant and more important because, again, there's more visibility and awareness of the sector, things like that. So could you talk a little bit about where you feel like the conversations are going to be heading as we go into the next couple of years?
Yeah, sure. I mean, basically, for us, there are two key things coming out of the back end of this crisis. The first one is a kind of slightly negative, but something that will need to be tackled. There's been a lot of discussion about ventilation and about air cleansing. And I think we've talked before about different systems and processes that we might be exploring in the UK. With the level of transmission rate we have now, which is 25 per 100,000, which is really low, it seems unlikely that government is going to do very much about that in terms of legislation or insisting that this needs to be done. However, for a cultural infrastructure plan, we need to tackle the quality of air in our venues over a long period of time, because now we do know, and we have an example of how we are not resistant to airborne pathogens in a way that we probably could have known before, but had never been really clearly demonstrated to us. And what we do not want to do is come out of this and just say, this was a one-off. We get caught out by the fact that we didn't have great air quality in our rooms. Now we're just going to go back to where we were before. This is a constant risk. We're trying not to talk about COVID in those discussions. We're trying to have a conversation with all tiers of government saying, look, okay, we understand that you're still in that kind of COVID thing, but let's start talking about air quality. Let's start talking about that across maybe a 3 to 5 year infrastructure investment plan. And let's also, very crucially, me and Michael, I think we talk about this a lot. Let's not talk about this as a fenced in specialist cultural issue that will then attract the kind of budgets that are thrown to culture as the last person in the line after you've done everything about employment and the economy and society and everything else. Whatever's left over goes to culture. Okay, so what we're doing is we're positioning this conversation about air quality in the public health agenda.
Yeah.
And that's a very simple public health issue. Do you want to do prevention or do you want to do cure?
Right.
Okay, and it's much cheaper for government in the long term, despite the flaws in our democratic system, which sees these churns of government. A government should be able to understand it's cost the British government £327 billion, so close to $500 billion to manage the outcome of poor quality spaces, high contagion levels, failure to tackle transmission. We could clean the air in all our venues, not just music venues, but theaters and art centers and museums and libraries for about $6 billion. So about $8 billion. What do you want to do? Do you want to wait until the next £327 billion crisis where your hospitals are filling up and everything else? Or do you want to spend £8 billion in a structure through over 3 years, tackling the fact that particularly Western democracies like the States, like the UK, is come on, let's get on top of this. There are lots of examples of better practice than us around the world. So we've started that process. We're asking for the government to fund independent audit of our internal spaces. It's very cheap to do, but it would tell us exactly what the scale of that problem is.
Nice. Now, you're also looking at ownership of venues, which is clearly a structural challenge here in the States. Talk a little bit about how that's going. And
the second issue we have, and I know it's different in different states because I've been to lots of your meetings, and you have several different models. It's almost like you're 50 different countries. Imagine that. Okay, but we have a very, very definite problem in the UK, but there are other countries in Europe. 93% of our venue operators are tenants. They do not own their own building. And this was something we've been talking about, as you know, Michael, we've been talking about it for years. We're saying that is a really weird way to run culture, to operate it and try and make a profit out of it so that the money that you make can pay a private landlord the maximum commercial rent for a property in an area that our work is regenerating and dragging people towards and making hip and cool. And people want to live in that neighborhood because it's got great, vibrant nightlife. And then what happens is the property rate goes up and up and up and up, and then we get forced out. Right. So we want to take ownership of what we call the freeholds. I don't know if that's the same in the US, but the overall ownership of the building, which we've created a new vehicle to do that called Music Venue Properties. Music Venue Properties is a multi-million, more than a £200 million project to acquire the overall ownership of those buildings and to then come to leasehold arrangements for long periods of time with trusted venue operators that have a secure tenancy at a lower than market rate that is protected from commercial rises, because at last the landlord and the leasehold venue operator, their intent will be the same, that great music needs to happen in cities for those to be great cities. So we will act as a kind of benevolent landlord. We've started that project. We have our first 15 properties costed. We have an investment package we're bringing together, which is going to be a mix between donations, private investment, and some government capital. And essentially, we think we've created a very workable ownership model that will significantly reduce rents, provide a good value investment, particularly in post-COVID collapse of financial investment opportunities. The aim is to raise initially a very small sum. I think it's going to be 8 million to buy the first 15, and then we will move on to, that will be the proof of concept, and we are hoping over the next 10 years to acquire something like 50% of all our stock, so around about 500 venues.
I know here in the States, there's some parallel initiatives going. The Live Music Rescue Fund is one, again, that they're sort of at a little bit below the scale you're at this point. I think they're looking around half dozen or so venues at this point, give or take. But again, these are the type of things that, we hope are the structural kind of reforms that, again, coming out of the crisis, that we're able to think a little bit different, a little bit bigger. And again, what you laid out is exactly what's happened in every, kind of music community, in the States. And it's the story of Brooklyn, it's the story of Seattle, it's the story of Silver Lake in LA, it's happening in Nashville. It's just happening over and over again. We've lost venues here in Washington, D.C. through the same dynamic. And and we have to be able to think differently. Again, one of the reasons that we talked at the beginning of the show about the federal budget is certainly there is alignment. I mean, the Department of of Housing and Urban Development spends roughly $70 billion a year in American cities, and there are opportunities to align the interests of the music community with that type of federal spending, not just to support the industry, but because of the broader sort of context of what having these venues means. So that's exciting to hear, and we look forward to that. And just real quick, I know you had one more thing that we're going to talk about, which I am blanking on. I'm sorry, Mark. This is where my brain is these days. What was the other? You had one more piece that was super interesting to me. And
You have to tell me, Michael. It's been a long day. I mean, at the moment, we're supporting the venues to become back.
Oh, yeah. No, I'm sorry. Yes. So this whole notion, and this ties in a little bit of ownership, but the whole notion of how do we get some returns to venues that have been instrumental in starting careers, but don't necessarily benefit from it as artists go through the pipeline. And I'm not, you reference that in passing. I'm not sure if that's is that a campaign? Is that just an agenda setting topic? Is there anything specific you're doing around that? Or is it something you're just giving some thought to?
Well, I'm going to have to swear everybody who's listening to this to a non-disclosure agreement, and we'll just assume that's happening. We are specifically interested. Yeah, we're specifically interested in how can we create a value point at the point where venues are investing in the starter point of people's careers. How can we create a value point there that is intrinsically tied to the venue itself, that perhaps at the time it happens has an inconsequential value, but then as artists' careers expand, because that venue has the assets that go with that piece of content, I hate the word content, but that piece of intellectual property becomes massively more valuable. We're also interested in how we might get audiences part of that.
Yep.
And so what we've been looking at, and this is the non-disclosure part, we've been looking at the whole kind of blockchain and even the NFTs and this kind of emerging digital allocation of who owns things. And I'll tell you straight off, we are quite interested in. Does everybody know the famous Fillmore East posters? Okay, like if you have an original print of that and you put that on eBay, they're going for thousands of dollars, but it's still not money that's going to the Fillmore East. And so our question is, okay, what are the assets that are created by an initial show that maybe 100 people watch? How could the 100 people that were part of that show acquire something that is a record of the fact they were there, a unique piece of art that goes with it, a real thing that people want to own? So we're interested in the kind of what we have. I don't know if you have these in the US, but you have football cards, don't you?
Yep.
Okay, so we call them Panini stickers. You have an album of stickers. Okay. Yep. Could people acquire like a record of where they've been? Maybe there could be digital artwork that goes with the show. Maybe we create a 30-second record of that show that belongs to the venue and it belongs to the audience that paid to see the artist at that point. And because of the way that the blockchain and because of the way that ownership works, we're looking at methodologies by which over a period of, in my venue, 28 years ago, Oasis played one of their first shows.
Yep.
The poster for that show is currently on eBay for £620.
Yep.
I never made a single penny out of putting Oasis on, and I can't reprint the poster because it no longer belongs to me. But somebody's earning £620. Our question is, okay, what are the assets of a show that you might build into a digital format? Create something like a wallet of assets that, if I had that show now and people wanted to use it, I'd be making money out of it in a way that, and the really key element is it's new value. Yep. Because this is the really important thing, that why grassroots music venues struggle with this is because the industry is reluctant to give us any percentage of what it is that they are already making. They don't want to commit to giving us 1% of what Adele makes once we've given her 50 shows at our level and lost money, everyone, they don't want to hand that over. But if I had 50 posters from those things, Adele fans would want to own them. They would want to have a copy of it. They'd want to use it on their social media. And you know what? I mean, I don't know what it's like in the States, but everybody wants to be there. When I put on Oasis, 116 people came.
Yeah.
3,000 people claim to have been at that show.
That's right.
If I could prove who the 116 people were, or there were only 116 tokens of them being there, that's a really smart way to think about, okay, what's the value of this in 5 or 10 years or 20 years? And the last bit, Michael's going to know you're going to get on. The bit I really love about this idea is that for venues that take the greatest risks of promoting artists, that put on an artist on a Monday night in front of no more than 20 people because they believe in that artist at the time, those will become the most valuable tokens when those artists, because of our belief and trust in them, they have the biggest careers. I put on Adele in front of 28 people. If I had a way of doing a contract with those 28 people so that we were all getting paid now because we invested in the artist at that time, we'd all be making an absolute mint out of our investment that we made there.
I love what I'm seeing in the chat. I am nowhere smart enough to understand what any of this means, but these are the conversations that I'm so happy that you and Bev and the team at Music Venue Trust are thinking about, and it resonates so much with the structures here in the States, both in terms of, historically, again, pre-digital, the challenges with the independent record labels that would be putting all the risk capital into helping identify and grow artists that then would get poached by major labels. In the States, you could not get on commercial radio if you were not on a major label. And so it just, the unfair, sort of market practices were, just so endemic. And similarly, the fact that, the vulnerability of the independent venue community, moving into COVID is a long-term, 2 decades long policy failure, right? Set of bad policy decisions that have left this community incredibly vulnerable. And so again, we can't, and I'm so happy you shared everything that you guys are working on, because again, we can't be passive in this. We've got to understand, again, why do we do this work? Why do we do this work pre-COVID? And how are we going to kind of advance it moving forward? Because again, we can't be passive. We've got to be very active. So it is late on Friday where you are. So thank you for joining, as always, but especially on a Friday evening. And thanks for all of your work and your collaboration and all your smart ideas. And be safe and have a great weekend. And we'll talk to you soon.
It wouldn't be fair of me to leave without saying thank you very much, Michael, for bringing together the Revs initiative. It's been a huge benefit to us. We've been able to get into meetings we couldn't have possibly got into if we hadn't have been part of this initiative. So it was a pleasure to come and see you again. And please come have me back anytime you like. I'd love to explore this further.
I appreciate it.
Nice to see you.
Through the magic of technology, we're going to go from Friday night in Europe to Saturday morning in New Zealand. Terry, good morning. How are you?
Oh, I actually was going to miss this. I had 8 a.m. in my diary. It's actually 6:30 a.m. And I was lying in bed because I've only been asleep for a couple of hours. I was working late last night. And by the power of magic, yes, you're here in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, and Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's good to be here.
Oh, we're so happy to have you. And just the story about how you found the show, I think, is amazing, this particular program. We started this program again 14 months ago, just as an opportunity to try to just, highlight conversations and put stuff out into the world and put stuff into a public forum and archive stuff. And I don't know where you found us via LinkedIn to YouTube links, via something, but you emailed a couple months ago, and this is exactly why we've been doing this. It's just to get connected and to bring people in. And so we're going to talk a little bit about New Zealand. We're going to talk a little bit about your amazing career. We're going to talk about what you're up to. Why don't we start, just introduce yourself to the audience. So let's just start there, and then we're going to go broad back out to some big picture stuff, literally big picture.
Okay. Kia ora te katoa, no aitataki me mangaia me Rarotonga tōku mama, no Jamaica tōku papa. Kei te noho ana hau ki Tamaki Makaurau, ki Aotearoa. With my family, I have a family of 4 boys and I have 3 grandchildren. I live in Auckland, New Zealand. My mother is from the Cook Islands and my father is from Jamaica. Yes, and I live here currently. I thought that I was getting up early enough to not be a little bit sleepy. I'm going to admit right now I'm just a tad sleepy.
So Alex, last week we were interviewing our friends in Northwest Arkansas, and we started with maps because I literally wanted to get a sense of place. Alex, would you mind pulling up? We're going to do this. And again, for those of you watching, you may know exactly where New Zealand is and exactly the geography, but for those of you who don't, this is, I just think this is remarkable. So there's New Zealand in big picture, and you can see again, there's Australia, New Guinea, Indonesia, Thailand, Cambodia, and then go ahead and zoom in if you could, Alex, to just the geography of New Zealand itself.
And where my mother's, Michael, is that blue area of water, which you generally can't see us on a world map.
Yep.
Little island.
So Auckland has a metro population of about 1.7 million, give or take. Is that about right?
I hope so, yes.
That's what Wikipedia told me. Yes, yeah. So it's a major metropolitan area. And you've had a really fun career as a musician, recording artist, artist manager, TV presenter, and now talk a little bit about your role you're in now working with the city of Auckland in terms of creative economy kind of development work.
So I started working in local government as a full employer 3 years ago, 2017, the year that shall not be named. So 3 years ago, and then last year, I was working with our economic development agency. In fact, I sort of have to explain a little bit about how we're set up. So there's our main council, Auckland Council, and then there are council-controlled organisations, and each of those council-controlled organisations deal with different parts of the region. And I was sitting in the Chief Planning Office of Auckland Council under an initiative called the Southern Initiative, which was a place-based disruptor, I guess, that was set up. And that's how I came into local government officially. Prior to that, I delivered contracts, consulting and working with local boards. And as an artist as well. So I'd worked in quite a few areas. And then in the 3 years that I was working with the Southern Initiative, I was able to figure out, because no one actually told me how council worked when I started. My role was Social Innovation Specialist Advisor, Pacific Responsiveness. That was actually my whole title. And when I asked my boss what exactly that was, she was just like, just do how you feel. I was like, right. So she had a belief that she knew that I'd worked in the community, had delivered on different things in the community and events. And she told me to trust my heart. Like, can you imagine being in a job in local government where you're told to trust your heart? And that's how I was brought in. And then I sort of figured out there were these different levers, and you could influence policy, you could speak to the people that could help solve different issues, that the areas that we're working with were able to actually do these things. And so that's how I was introduced into local government officially. And then when I moved into our economic development agency, which is now a cultural economic development agency, when I moved into that space, I was like, oh, so what's this been about? Oh, you're in the economic development unit. It's like, oh, cool. Just better research and figure out what that is. And again, it was, this is what we want to do. We think you're the right person to be able to do it. And then they have provided me basically the space to, again, deliver on how I feel with my heart and lead with my heart to help serve the people of our region. And so while I'm paid by Auckland Unlimited, I work for the people. And that's just been my attitude since I've started. I was like, I'm sure everyone else that works for council thinks like this, but it's not just a unique perspective. You just need to find your peoples in that space that have the same sort of thinking. Yeah.
So Alex, we'll put some links to your creative work in the chat, and you've got a really dynamic website that goes deep into your history and who you are and how you think about things. And your new music video and all the stuff that you've been working on, the creative part of your life. We're going to talk about the kind of wonky part of your life. And again, one of the reasons that Music Policy Forum, founded in the year that you didn't want to mention a number of years ago, was around this notion of our communities, and particularly the United States and in Canada and North America, really trying to bring a lot more intention to what does it mean to help sustain their music community and understand it. And I think that conversation has evolved in the last 4 years away from, maybe more, not to disrespect anybody or speak ill of anything, but maybe, away from like, how do we get more tourists to town, or how do we, get a little bit more money in the system, and into, again, what we talk about at Music Policy Forum is how do we build stronger, more resilient, and more equitable music ecosystems. And in North America, that's a lot, because the layers of complexity of issues, when you start to take that on as a goal, get into a lot of things, a lot of issues, and a lot of understanding. Particularly, we've talked a lot in this program over the past year about, the fundamental underpinnings of the American music industry, as being really rooted in cultural appropriation and exploitation of a lot of folks. And, you're doing some incredibly deep thinking. And, we were fortunate to have a session with you a month or so ago where you walked through some of the kind of foundational orientation that you and your colleagues have in Auckland as you take on this kind of challenge of putting together kind of a cultural blueprint that, will hopefully get a lot of buy-in and support. Could you just kind of run through some of the ways that you're approaching the unique dynamics of New Zealand? And I think people in the audience will hear a lot of things that are going to resonate to us in the States and in Canada.
Absolutely. For starters, I'm not a mana whenua or tangata whenua. So that term is what we refer to the Indigenous people of Aotearoa of New Zealand. And because my mum was from the Pacific Islands, we are also closely related to Māori tangata whenua of Aotearoa through genealogy as well. So we have a similar language. Mm-hmm. But in terms of respect of the whenua of the land, I'm a visitor here. And in the work that I've been doing, once I sort of figured out in my 3 years, oh, right, so central government does this and local government does this, and seeing all these levers, the thing that I could see that was being repeated consistently was they were doing initiatives or programs, people that I was working with, then they'd come against a brick wall and then they sort of bang and then finish. And I was like, okay, well, maybe we should try a different way. But they just do the same thing again and hit the wall. And I was like, okay, so have you ever thought about doing something different? And I didn't know how to convey to them that if you don't do something different, you're just going to come up with the same result. It was like a common sense thing for me. But because local government is ruled by the Local Government Act, and there are certain things that have been put in place to behave in a certain way, in order for you to influence people's behavior to think a different way is a challenge in itself. And when I actually started in council, one of the first events that I went to was a local government conference, and it said that I had to dress in business dress, and I didn't understand what that was because I actually was wearing mumu, so sort of traditional colonial island dress wear, so bright coloured flowery dresses. And I said to my boss, so I'm just going to wear what I wear to work every day. But when I rolled up to the conference, everyone was staring at me. They were like, is this the cleaner? Has she serving us some food? Is she the entertainment? I was like, well, actually, I sit in the chief planning office. And, so that was one of the things that I experienced quite early on, realizing this was the attitude of the majority of people that I was dealing with. And when someone that I was in a conference and they spotted me and they were like, I started talking to them and they realized, oh, she actually works for local government. I realized that there were a lot of different barriers that I was going to deal with, apart from the fact that I looked like this. So the behavior was the thing that I was gunning for, I guess, and trying to find my peoples so that instead of trying to battle, I'll just find someone and have that conversation and you'd be on the same page. Hey, why don't we disrupt this way and try it this way? because being part of this other initiative, I didn't realize that there were certain ways that you should be doing things. And I'm not talking about breaking the Local Government Act's rules, but if I wanted to talk to somebody about an initiative around how we could get the community involved with a more of an understanding around the environment. We have water care that deals with the elements of water in our city. I'd go to the director of water care and say to him, hey, I've got this great idea, because I've got his email and I can find his phone number in the directory. So that's what I would do, and go direct to the top. Whereas there's usually a process that you have to do. So with that type of attitude, my learnings when I started working on a strategy for our region around the creative economy, it was those sorts of things, experiences that I was bringing to the table, apart from the fact that we engaged with quite a few people, stakeholders across the region in that space. The disruptors that I could see, and we call it entrepreneurship, it's self-initiative, so disrupting within and finding those levers that you can influence. So being able to think like that, the strategy ended up encompassing that basically as its modus operandi, because to deliver a strategy that is slightly encompasses an idea of collective well-being. It requires a certain type of thinking in the space, but also a type of behavior. And so while you can pull out a strategy and say, this is the place where we're starting from and we're moving to this place over here, for those people that are used to thinking in a certain way, you have to show them what that could look like. And that could be either by demonstrating it yourself, and then when the outcomes happen, and I'm not focused on outcomes, but other people in that space are, when they say something like the impact that what you're doing, and because you've changed your behavior in the way that you're behaving with them, with the people that you're serving, when people start to see that change, then that's one way that I was thinking how you start to bring them on the journey with you, instead of trying to do an abrupt U-turn on them and saying, well, I think you should do it like this, and this is the reason why. So there were lots of things that I felt that needed to be massaged in that space, and part of the strategy is that. So for instance, when we talk about the current economic framework that we work in, which is really just, it's unidirectional, it looks at how we can just make more and more money and tips into the future and doesn't really take much consideration of future resources and what will be left. And so that's explained by a hand that's holding an orange. So the orange is beautiful and sweet, and it doesn't have seeds that you can grow more oranges, but you can enjoy that fruit right there and then. And at the other end of the scale, the analogy carries on with a tree of oranges that have seeds that you can grow and feed more people. And when I explain to people these two concepts, because sometimes the economic speak isn't necessarily the way that you want to get through to people. See, this is my alarm to tell me to get up. Yeah, so when I explain to people that what would you prefer, the orange that's so sweet and beautiful that enjoy now, or the one that can carry on and feed people forever, which one would you go with? They always go with this one. I go, great, because this is what we're going to do. We're going to move towards this space by looking at these types of things, and I really want you to come with us. And it has to be that sort of attitude. And maybe it's because I spent 25 years making television, 20 of those years Indigenous television, and maybe all those different things that I've negotiated to get young people to watch shows. And for the space that I worked in was around normalizing the Indigenous language here in Aotearoa. So there were different things that we had put into our programs that would entice people to come. And so I sort of applied that same sort of mentality to my work in local government and around the strategy work.
And I think as you know, again, a big part of where the pivot that we're doing, we were talking about this earlier in the program, a big part of the pivot that we are doing as advocates and activists is, you know, like we're sort of in the middle, and where I live, we have our every 17-year, you know, cicada infestation. So we have all, you know, we've got hundreds of millions of these cicadas have been living underground, these bugs. They've all now come out and they're doing the thing they do every 17 years, and they're shedding their skin, and they're literally moving on to their next part of their mission. And I think that's where a lot of us feel like we are. It's like we've been in this incredibly challenging, difficult, unprecedented time. And of course, New Zealand very famously had a different path on COVID than we've had in the United States and in many other countries. But we're getting ready to kind of get focused on what comes next. And again, if a lot of the conversations we have are, how do we move beyond the sort of, conceptual conversations about what we'd like to have better in our cultural ecosystems, and how to actually activate that? And I think something that's really interesting about your role as a policymaker is that you are, and I don't want to flatter you, especially early on Saturday morning, but you are an artist, you are a storyteller, and you've been in the industry. So you have these three sort of competencies that are pretty unusual, especially when you think about, coming in to try to do like a music strategy or to do a creative, industry sort of concept, because you actually know yourself, how the industry works because you've lived it as an artist and as a manager. You've done the storytelling translation work. And so I think, part of what is going to be really interesting, and I know we can talk a little bit more about it. I know you can't go into any detail until the sort of recommendations and the framework is really fully released, but there's a storytelling frame around the work that you're doing, which we've struggled with in the States. And I know, like, when I write a music strategy for a city, it tends to be like 17 bullet point recommendations that then people are like, I don't know what to do with this. This doesn't mean anything to me. And so could you talk a little bit more about, some of the framing? I mean, would it be appropriate for me to share the mission statement that you shared with us earlier? Because I just think the way that this is articulated is so beautiful.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, so some of the language that you use, just to give people a sense of this, is we celebrate, support, and enable the creative economy as pivotal to our well-being, intrinsic to regional identity, and key to our economic transformation. I mean, that is just a lovely, and I think a very different way of framing all the work that we're all doing. Could you, speak about that as sort of a jumping off point to then what does that look like in practice in terms of strategies?
How we came together, how that mission statement came together was we had two working advisory groups. And so being part of Economic Development Agency, the focus is all the things that you mentioned before, Michael, because I just figured this out like in the last, I signed my contract and we went into lockdown. So I wasn't hanging out with my colleagues. And in fact, now when I meet people, I'm like, so what do you do? And so I didn't really understand the extent of what Auckland Unlimited, then called AT, so Auckland Tourism Events and Economic Development Agency. I knew those words were in the title. I didn't understand what it is. So I didn't get to meet all those different people that worked in those different spaces. So you can imagine before, when I was in council and figured out there were all these different levers that you could influence. And then I moved in this Economic Development Agency and there's major events and there's tourism. So in my mind, I was thinking, this is great. And investment as well. So I can talk to all these people. They're right here. They're my colleagues. And I can reach out to them and talk to them about these things that I'm thinking about. And this has been probably the most beautiful thing about it is that I generally don't tell people I'm not an economist. I'm just the creative that's doing these things and serving our people. When I started talking to these different business units at work and explaining this concept around how we can influence and use our own levers, and I'll be saying this over and over again, is that they could see this idea of this orange and moving to this orange tree and the benefits that it can bring to the region. As soon as I explained it to them, so when I spoke to the dude who does huge investments, because we have Screen Auckland that sits underneath us, so Netflix and Amazon and so forth are working in that space. And so I'm just going, so we could look at how we could partner up with the Ministry of Social Development, who have programs where there are people that now has been exacerbated even further, who are unemployed, may have moved from manufacturing and looking for something else because it's now a sunset industry. So what are the sunrise industries that we can move people into? There are opportunities to have businesses working together that may have been, there was one company that was working in props for movies, and the business had quietened down, and they've moved into making prosthetics.
Mm-hmm.
And then they to making gifts, and now they're back to making movies again. So being able to be in those places, partnering up with both private business and public to be able to see how we can influence in these different spaces. When we spoke to our major events team, we asked them, what would be how would we go about trying to bring in graduates who need to spend a week of work experience on an event in order for them to fulfill their certificate, for instance. And because they didn't have these opportunities, what were the things that we could do to help support in that space? Or we have an innovation hub where we have shared working spaces, and we've just had a media design school open up in one of our spaces as well. How can we move into here and bring more Māori and Pacific young people into the space, because we know that there's less than 6% of Māori, of people who work in creative tech are Māori and Pacific. So how can we up those numbers and support? And so I just kept on looking around the office at work, actually, and figured out, I could just talk to this person over here and see how we can work with what they're doing right now, because obviously every single unit has their own strategy and how they're going to do things. But because our government have introduced well-being into government, and into local government, and they've basically said to us we can figure out ourselves how we're going to deliver this. And everyone that I work with at Auckland Unlimited are aware of this. They're completely open to the strategy, but they would be anyway because they're my colleagues. But when I talk to them about how we can hit some of those markers for them when it comes to these well-being outcomes for their units, it's sort of showing them a pathway. So there's an opportunity there for me to re-educate, I guess, to a certain extent. Like, for instance, I had one of our business unit people, because we also run business events, and they were looking for entertainment, and they wanted to get some young person to sing while they were eating. And I said no. Mm-hmm. And she was like, what? And I said, this young person will be the first time they're standing in maybe in front of about 1,000 people, and you're going to be eating and ignoring them? I said, no. You can have a young person like that, but you need to be staring at them and paying attention. So, and that was an education for that person, because they were like, I said, if you just want to play music, I can get someone to put a playlist of local music for you and play it off Spotify or something, but don't treat an artist like that. So that tiny little thing of, just being able to re-educate, because I'm right there. And it's not, I don't think that when I deal with people and they have different perspective on things, I don't immediately go, I'm just going to ant on you. I take my time to understand why they think a certain way, and then I usually figure out, I guess, what you were saying before, that whole storytelling thing, isn't it, Michael? Just taking the time to think and listen and speak to people and allow them to show me how they feel about things, and then working through that and working with that. Yeah,
and I think, and we would love to schedule a time later this year when the plan is out, and to really kind of workshop it, to go through it in detail. But I think what's transformative about it, and you touched on it, is, again, in our context, we place music, when we think about it in terms of policy, or we think about it in terms of legal rights, or everything, we think about it in terms of consumer economy. And so music is competing with film, music is competing with video games, music is competing, with things where people, it's entertainment, and it's not, it's based on a consumer choice model, when, the word you use, which is exactly the right frame, is well-being. And there's been good work done in the States. The Kennedy Center and the National Endowment for the Arts have got a very interesting initiative in partnership with the NIH around sound health and understanding the role of music in terms of our humanity. We're a very angry country. We're a very divided country. We're a very toxic country in many ways. And the ability to maximize the opportunity for people to access art, access music is really essential to our humanity. And we need to have policy interventions that, reflect the value that brings to us. And we take that for granted in ways that are very sad. And again, that's why we all do this work collectively. So we're going to, I'm rolling my eyes at Kate Becker in the chat saying nice things. So this is a great way to wrap up this run of programs that we've done, for the last 15 months. Again, we've done this work and done this Friday program on a weekly basis because people have been so kind in terms of their feedback and coming to the program and finding people, connecting with people like you, Terry. We wouldn't have connected with you if it wasn't for these platforms. Again, Alex Dolvin, thank you for all your great work, just keeping the live show going and working the archive. Terry's music and most recent video is in the chat. Everybody check it out. Is it true that this is next year will be your first solo album after all this time? You're doing your first solo release. So congratulations on feeding that part of your soul and keeping that stuff moving. And I think we're going to wrap. So again, thanks to Terry, thanks to Mark, thank you, Alex, thank you, Music Policy Forum board, and all of our friends who have been on this program. We've had over 140 guests over the last year. Everybody, please take advantage of the archive. It's there as a resource for everybody to hear a lot of ideas and tap into a lot of resources. We are not going away. We're going to be making announcements the next week or so. But again, we're going to be doing this program on a monthly basis and supplementing with different types of models. As always, we value your feedback and your ideas and your very generously, kindly worded constructive criticism. You can email us anytime at musicpolicyforum@gmail.com. Have a very safe and very pleasant Memorial Day. The archives are all at the musicpolicyforum.org website. In response to that question, have a great rest of your Friday, everybody. Terry, thank you for getting up so early. Go back to bed. We will see you guys soon. Cheers. Thanks, everybody.